You ever hear applause turn into something ugly? Most folks think clapping means celebration, pride, gratitude. But sometimes it sounds like dirt hitting a coffin lid. That's what it sounded like the night my wife handed me divorce papers at my own retirement party. 120 people standing in the Union Hall on Carnegie Avenue, sheet cake from Dave's Market, plastic forks. My name iced in blue letters that said, "Congratulations, Joe, 35 years of service. 35 winters climbing frozen poles in Cleveland. 35 summers sweating through storm calls while other men grilled hot dogs in their backyards." I kept the lights on when Lake Erie wine snapped lines like toothpicks. I worked double shifts during the blackout of 2003 while my kids were still small enough to cry when the house went dark. That night, they clapped, and my kids laughed. "Best day ever," my son shouted. I remember that part very clearly. I just didn't understand why. I'd woken up that morning proud. That's the truth. Retirement wasn't something I ever imagined for myself. Linemen don't retire. They just slow down until their knees give out or their shoulders won't lift a harness anymore. But I'd made it. 35 years without a single serious accident. A couple scars, sure. Lightning strike once. Fell 8 feet during an ice storm back in '94. But I walked away from it all. I shaved slow that morning, used the good aftershave, the one I only wore at weddings and funerals. My wife, Carol, stood in the doorway watching me. She didn't smile. I remember that, too. "You ready for your big send-off?" she asked. Her voice was flat. Not angry, not warm, just flat. "Yeah," I said. "Figured I'd better enjoy it. Nobody throws a party when you're 63 and broke." She gave a tight little smile, the kind you use on strangers. That was it. I thought she was just tired. She'd been distant for months. I blamed myself. Long hours, stress, always smelling like creosote and diesel. I figured retirement might fix things. Maybe she'd finally get the version of me that didn't answer his phone at 2 a.m. I didn't know she'd already decided she didn't want that version either. The hall was decorated with orange extension cords draped like streamers. The guys thought that was funny. Someone hung my old hard hat from the rafters. There were speeches. My supervisor, Mark, talked about how I never missed a shift, how I volunteered for storms nobody else wanted, how I trained half the younger crew standing there. I stood there, nodding like a fool, swallowing pride so it didn't spill out of my eyes. Then my daughter, Emily, asked for the microphone. That surprised me. She'd never liked my job, said it embarrassed her when her college friends talked about their fathers being lawyers and consultants. She took the mic like she was at a graduation ceremony. "Dad," she said, smiling wide, "we're really proud of you for finally being done." The room chuckled politely. 35 years is a long time to work one job. I think it's time you moved on. There was something in her tone I couldn't place. A tightness. My son, Brian, stepped forward holding a white envelope. I thought maybe it was a card. Something sentimental. He handed it to Carol. Carol didn't hesitate. She walked straight toward me, heels clicking against the linoleum. That's when the room went quiet. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look angry either. She looked relieved. "Joe," she said, loud enough for the back tables to hear, "I think this is the perfect time." She placed the envelope in my hands. I remember noticing how steady her fingers were. I opened it. Legal paper has a sound when you unfold it. Dry. Official. Petition for dissolution of marriage. I read the first line 3 times before it made sense. Someone laughed. Not mean, confused. Then my son clapped. "Best day ever," he said again. And my daughter joined in. A few co-workers, thinking this was some kind of joke, awkwardly clapped along. My ears started ringing. I looked up at Carol. She didn't flinch. "You're retired now," she said evenly. "No income coming in except that small pension. We've talked about this. I can't carry you." Carry me. I felt something inside my chest shift sideways. "I worked 35 years, I said. My voice sounded far away, like it belonged to somebody else. "Yes," she said, "and now you're done." There was no yelling, no drama, just quiet cruelty wrapped in practicality. My daughter stepped closer. "Dad, this is for the best. You're not ambitious. Mom deserves more." Ambitious? I'd climbed poles in sleet so they could have heat. I'd missed birthdays to restore power in nursing homes. I'd mortgaged my body so they could live in a brick colonial in Parma instead of a duplex in old Brooklyn. And I wasn't ambitious. The room was silent now. No one clapped anymore. Mark stepped forward, confused. "Joe, what's going on?" I folded the papers carefully. Carefully. That part matters. Because in that moment, I understood something very important. They had already decided who I was. A working loser. A man whose value expired the moment the paycheck slowed down. And they wanted the world to see it. That's why they did it there. Public humiliation is easier when you have an audience. I looked at my kids. Really looked at them. Not the toddlers who used to run into my arms when I came home smelling like rain and gasoline. Not the teenagers who asked for car money and college tuition. I looked at the adults standing in front of me, clapping at my erasure, and I nodded. "Well," I said quietly, "I suppose timing is everything." Carol blinked, almost disappointed I wasn't yelling. I handed the microphone back to Emily. "Go ahead," I said. "Finish the celebration." Then I picked up my coat. No one stopped me. Not one person. The parking lot air felt colder than it should have for late September. I sat in my truck for a long time. Not crying, not shouting, just breathing. You ever feel betrayal settle like dust? Not explosive, just heavy, coating everything. That's what it felt like. I thought about the second mortgage I'd taken in 2008 so Emily could study abroad in Florence. I thought about co-signing Brian's business loan that he defaulted on after 2 years. I thought about the house deed. Both our names on it. Retired, disposable, carried. I started the engine and drove home slowly, like I wasn't sure where home was anymore. When I pulled into the driveway, Carol's car wasn't there. She'd stayed to finish the cake. Inside the house, the silence felt different. Not peaceful. Vacant. I walked into the kitchen and opened the drawer where we kept important documents. I didn't know why I did that. Habit, maybe. The house was in both our names, yes. But the land, the original purchase, that had come from my inheritance after my father died in 1989. I'd used that money for the down payment. Carol always said it didn't matter. What's mine is yours. Funny how that changes. I sat at the kitchen table and ran my thumb over the wood grain. I'd refinished that table myself 20 years ago. I wasn't ambitious, I wasn't educated, I wasn't refined, but I knew wires, I knew grids, I knew systems, and, most importantly, I knew patience. They thought retirement meant I was done climbing. They were right about one thing. I was done climbing poles, but I wasn't done climbing. Not by a long shot. That night, alone in my own house, I unfolded those divorce papers again. And I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. It still does when I tell it. But because I finally saw the shape of things. You see, when people show you exactly what they think you're worth, you don't argue. You adjust. And sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who knows how to shut the lights off. That was the first night I slept like a retired man. And the last night they assumed I was finished. We'll stop there for tonight, kid, because revenge, the smart kind, doesn't rush. And what I did next, well, let's just say the applause didn't last very long. You'd think I'd have cried that night. I didn't. I sat at the kitchen table until the clock above the stove hit midnight. The same clock Carol bought at a yard sale 20 years ago because it felt cozy. Funny word for something that watched your life fall apart. The house felt different. Not empty, just revealed. When humiliation is public, the silence afterward gets honest. I walked room to room slowly. The living room where I'd patched drywall after Brian threw a baseball indoors. The staircase I reinforced when it started to creak. The garage where I rebuilt engines so my kids could drive something better than what I had at their age. Working loser. That phrase echoed in my head. Not ambitious, not refined, not enough. I opened the filing cabinet in the den. Bottom drawer, the one nobody touched but me. Inside were copies of everything. Mortgage statements, loan documents, college tuition receipts, that business loan I co-signed for Brian, still technically tied to my name after he defaulted, and something else, the original land purchase from 1989. My father's land money had been the down payment. The attorney back then had structured it in a way that protected that portion. Carol's name had been added later, yes, but the equity tied to the original investment. Separate. I hadn't thought about that in years. I ran my finger down the paperwork slowly. 35 years climbing poles teaches you one thing. Always check the line before you touch it. I checked the line, and I realized something. They thought retirement meant I was done thinking. They thought I'd roll over, sign what they handed me, and fade politely into a smaller apartment somewhere near the highway. They were counting on me to be embarrassed, ashamed, broken. Instead, I made coffee at 1:12 a.m. and started making a list. Not an angry list, a factual one. My pension structure, the house equity breakdown, the outstanding co-signed debt, the small investment account Carol didn't know I'd opened 12 years ago after a particularly bad ice storm bonus. I didn't hide money. I saved it quietly. There's a difference. At 2 a.m., I finally stood up and walked into our bedroom. Her side of the closet was half empty. She'd already moved some things. Of course she had. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned. The public spectacle, the applause, the timing, right when my active income stopped. She didn't want a retired lineman. She wanted an exit before the numbers shrank. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the indentation her body had left in the mattress over decades. 38 years of marriage, reduced to a manila envelope. I didn't rage. I didn't smash anything. I just nodded to myself. Because here's the thing, kid. When someone underestimates you publicly, they usually overestimate themselves privately, and overconfidence makes people sloppy. The next morning, I called in a favor. Not to a lawyer, not yet. To an old friend from the utility company, Frank D'Angelo. He'd retired 5 years before me. Smart guy, married to a real estate attorney. "Joe," he said, surprised. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "Just need to ask you something about asset separation." There was a pause. "Ah," he said quietly. "That kind of retirement." "Yeah." He didn't ask for details. Men our age don't need them. He just said, "Come by at 10. Bring paperwork." I hung up and looked around the kitchen. Same cabinets, same refrigerator magnets from vacations, same coffee maker. But I wasn't the same man who'd walked into that retirement party. Something had settled inside me overnight. Not revenge, not yet. Clarity. They'd clapped when they thought I was finished. They thought cutting off the paycheck cut off the power. They forgot something. I spent 35 years restoring power, and sometimes the man who knows the grid best is the one who knows exactly which switch to flip. That was the morning I stopped being embarrassed and started being strategic. We'll pause there. Because the next move? That's when they realized retirement doesn't mean powerless. It just means you finally have time. You learn something after 35 years working with electricity. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It fails in sections. One neighborhood goes dark before the whole city realizes there's a problem. That's how I approached it. Quietly. Piece by piece. At 10 sharp, I sat at Frank D'Angelo's kitchen table with a folder under my arm. His wife, Marlene, poured coffee, and didn't ask questions. She'd seen enough divorce paperwork over the years to recognize the look in a man's eyes. I laid everything out. The land purchase from '89, the inheritance clause, the mortgage restructure when we refinanced in 2008, the small investment account Carol didn't know about, separate, legally clean. Marlene adjusted her glasses and read without emotion. After about 20 minutes, she looked up at me. "Joe," she said carefully, "do you know how much of that house is technically traceable to your separate funds?" "I've got a rough idea." She slid the paper toward me. "It's more than rough." I read the number, and for the first time since the party, I felt something that wasn't hurt. It was balance. Carol thought she was walking away with half of everything. That's what she'd told Emily and Brian, I'm sure. I could almost hear it. "Your father will be fine. We'll split it evenly. I deserve that after putting up with him all these years." But she hadn't accounted for documentation. She hadn't accounted for the boring man who kept copies of everything. And she definitely hadn't accounted for the fact that I never mixed my father's money with joint accounts beyond the down payment structure. Marlene leaned back. "If you fight this properly, Joe, the equity division changes significantly." "How significantly?" "Enough that her celebration might feel premature." Frank didn't smile, but his eyes did. I nodded once. Not vindictive, just steady. When I got home, Carol's car was in the driveway. She was in the kitchen, scrolling her phone, calm as ever. "You talked to anyone yet?" she asked casually. "Just gathering information," I said. She didn't look up. "Good. I'd like this handled quickly." Of course she would. Quick meant less scrutiny. Quick meant less math. I poured myself coffee and sat across from her. "You know," I said, almost conversational, "it's funny how timing works." She glanced up, mildly annoyed. "What do you mean?" "I mean filing the same week my active income stops. That's efficient." Her jaw tightened. "This isn't about money, Joe." "It's always about money." But I didn't say that. Instead, I just nodded. "Of course." She mistook that nod for surrender. That was the first crack in her confidence. That evening, my son Brian called. Didn't ask how I was. Didn't apologize for shouting at the party. He got straight to it. "So, what's the plan with the house?" There it was. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm sorry that happened publicly." Just logistics. "I'm reviewing options," I said evenly. "Well," he continued, "Mom shouldn't get stuck with maintenance costs. The place is too much for one person anyway." Stuck. I stared at the wall while he talked, and this was the same kid who once hid behind my legs during thunderstorms. Now he was budgeting my erasure. "I'll make sure nobody gets stuck," I said quietly. He exhaled like that solved everything. "Good. We just want this smooth." Smooth. You know what's smooth? Ice. Right before you fall through it. That night I didn't feel sad. That surprised me. The humiliation had burned off. What replaced it was something colder. Assessment. They thought they'd taken control by going public. But public moves can't be undone, and once you expose your hand, you can't reshuffle. They'd shown me exactly how they viewed me: a liability, a cost center, a man past usefulness. So I did what any lineman does when a system fails. I isolated the problem, and I prepared to reroute the power. Because here's something they forgot, kid. Retirement doesn't shrink a man's mind. It frees it. And when people clap too early, they don't hear the floor starting to shift under their own feet. That shift? That started the moment Marlene circled that number on the paper, and none of them saw it coming. 3 days after the party, the applause was gone. No more congratulations. No more smiling co-workers. Just paperwork and silence. Carol had moved into the guest room. We passed each other in the hallway like neighbors in a duplex. Polite, distant, efficient. That's the word she liked now. Efficient. I'd always thought marriage was about endurance. Turns out to her it was a contract with an expiration date. Her attorney's letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. It outlined the proposed equitable division: 50% of the home, 50% of retirement funds, spousal support considerations due to income disparity. Income disparity. I almost laughed. 35 years of climbing poles in sleet, and now I was the underperforming spouse. I drove to Marlene's office the next morning. She read the proposal slowly, lips pressed tight. "They're assuming full marital equity," she said. "They're assuming a lot," I replied. She opened my original documentation again, the land purchase, the inheritance trace, the refinance records. "You're entitled to reclaim a significant separate portion before division," she said calmly. "If we push this, the math changes dramatically." "How dramatic?" She slid a legal pad toward me and did the calculation in neat blue ink. The number was not small. In fact, it meant Carol wouldn't be walking away with half. Not even close. That evening, she was in the kitchen when I got home. She didn't look worried. That told me something important. She didn't know. "You meet with anyone?" she asked casually. "Yes." "And?" "I think we'll need to adjust expectations." She paused mid-slice on a tomato. "What does that mean?" "It means the equity isn't as simple as you think." For the first time since the party, she really looked at me. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the original down payment, the inheritance, the way it was structured." Her face changed slowly, like someone realizing the ice beneath them wasn't as thick as they thought. "That was decades ago," she said. "It's all marital now." "Not exactly." Silence filled the kitchen, heavy, charged. "You're going to fight me?" she asked. Her voice wasn't angry. It was incredulous, like I'd violated some unwritten agreement that I was supposed to go quietly. "I'm going to protect what's mine," I said. "And what about what's fair?" I looked at her. Fair. You don't serve divorce papers at a retirement party in front of your husband's co-workers if you're concerned about fair. "I think we define that word differently," I replied. She didn't yell. She retreated. That's when I knew the first crack had widened. Overconfidence is loud at first, then it gets quiet. 2 days later, my daughter called. Her tone wasn't celebratory anymore. "Dad, Mom says you're disputing the house division." "I'm reviewing it." "Why would you do that, after everything she's done for you?" There it was again. Carried, maintained, tolerated. "Emily," I said gently, "do you remember who paid for Florence?" A pause. "That's not the point." "It is when we're discussing assets." She exhaled sharply. "You're being stubborn." Maybe I was. But stubborn built that house. Stubborn kept me climbing poles at 58 when younger men quit. Stubborn paid off debts nobody thanked me for. "If standing up for myself is stubborn," I said quietly, "I'll live with that." She hung up before I finished the sentence. That night, alone in the living room, I didn't feel victorious. I felt something steadier. Respect for myself. You see, kid, the humiliation at that party had done something useful. It burned away my need to be liked. Once that's gone, you become very hard to manipulate. Carol thought I'd fold because I always had, because peace was easier, because I loved my family more than I loved being right. But when love gets weaponized against you, you stop offering it as collateral. A week after the party, her attorney sent a revised email. The tone had shifted. They requested documentation, requested clarification, requested time. That's how you know the grid's changing. When the people who thought they held the switch start asking questions. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I just kept sending paperwork. Calm, organized, precise, because revenge isn't loud. It's structural. And the structure they thought they were demolishing? It was built by a man who understood foundations. And foundations don't collapse easily. especially not when the man who poured them is still standing inside the house. You know what's interesting about people who humiliate you publicly? They never expect correction to be public, too. 2 weeks after the retirement party, Carol hosted a small dinner. I wasn't invited, technically, but it was in my house. Neighbors, a couple from church, even Mark from the utility company. I came home from meeting Marlene and saw cars lining the curb. Through the window I could see Carol laughing, relaxed again, comfortable, like the storm had passed. She'd already rewritten the story. I stood in the doorway for a minute before walking in. Nobody noticed at first. Then someone did that awkward half-smile thing. "Oh, Joe, hey." Carol's smile stiffened. "We're just having a few people over," she said, like I was a distant cousin who'd wandered in. I nodded. "Smells good." I set my folder down on the counter. Not dramatic, just deliberate. The room quieted the way it had at the retirement party. Funny how silence remembers. Mark cleared his throat. "Joe, how you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said. "Actually, I just finalized some paperwork today." Carol's eyes flicked to the folder. "Joe," she said under her breath, warning in her tone. I ignored it. "Turns out," I continued evenly, "the House division won't be 50-50 after all." Forks paused midair. "What are you talking about?" Carol asked too quickly. "I'm talking about the inheritance structure from '89, the equity trace." Nobody understood the details, but they didn't need to. What they understood was tone, confidence. I wasn't pleading. I wasn't angry. I was certain. "After separate property adjustments," I said calmly, "the numbers shift." Mark blinked. "Shift how?" "Significantly." Carol's face drained of color. "That's not settled," she snapped. "It will be." The room felt smaller. I looked at the same people who'd watched me stand there at the party holding divorce papers while my kids clapped. No one clapped now. "I don't plan to drag anything out," I added, "but I do plan to be accurate." Accurate, such a boring word, but it carries weight. Carol stood abruptly. "This isn't the place." "You made the last one the place," I said gently. That landed. Hard. No shouting, no theatrics. Just a reminder. Public cuts leave public scars. Later that night, after everyone left, she cornered me in the kitchen. "You embarrassed me." I almost smiled. That's an interesting word choice. Her hands trembled. "You're being vindictive." "No," I said quietly. "I'm being precise." There's a difference. Vindictive is emotional. Precise is controlled. And control had shifted. I could see it in her posture now, the way her certainty had thinned. She thought retirement made me small. Instead, it made me patient. The next morning, Brian called. His tone wasn't confident anymore. "Dad, Mom says the house situation might be complicated." "It is." "Well, we don't want this getting ugly." I stared out the window at the oak tree I planted when he was born. "Ugly would have been yelling at the party," I said. "I didn't yell." He didn't respond, because he knew. They'd expected collapse. They got calculation. Here's the thing, kid. When someone strips you of your identity in front of others, you have two options. You shrink, or you stand straighter. I stood straighter. Not to hurt them, not even to win, but because I finally understood something simple. A man who spent 35 years climbing poles doesn't fear heights, and once you stop fearing the fall, you become very difficult to push. That dinner party was the first time Carol realized I wasn't retreating. It was the first time my kids understood the applause had consequences. And it was only the beginning. Because money was just the surface. What they really miscalculated was the quiet man at the end of the table who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. There's something people forget when they decide you're small. They forget history. and history leaves fingerprints. A week after that dinner party, I received a different kind of call. Not from Carol, not from the kids, from the bank. The woman on the line sounded careful. "Mr. Donnelly, we're reviewing the co-signed commercial loan from 2017. There's been movement on the account." Movement. That's a polite word for trouble. Brian's landscaping business, the one I co-signed for, had defaulted 2 years back. I'd quietly covered part of the debt to protect my credit. Never made a speech about it. Never held it over his head. Fathers don't do that. But now I listened very carefully. "Is my name still attached to the liability?" I asked. "Yes, sir, as guarantor." Guarantor. Another polite word. I hung up and sat very still. You see, while they were celebrating my freedom at that retirement party, they'd forgotten something. I wasn't just a paycheck. I was structural support, and structural support can be removed. I called Marlene. She didn't sound surprised. "If you're still guarantor," she said, "you can negotiate terms, especially if he's missed payments." "What kind of terms?" "The kind that protect you first." Protect you first. That phrase felt new in my mouth. I met Brian at a coffee shop the next day. Neutral ground. He looked uneasy. "Dad, what's this about?" I slid a copy of the loan paperwork across the table. "You didn't mention you were behind again." He stared at it like it was written in another language. I was going to handle it. With what? Silence. He shifted in his chair. "Why are you bringing this up now?" "Because you clapped when your mother handed me divorce papers. Because you called my retirement the best day ever. Because you assumed I'd quietly keep covering liabilities while you repositioned yourselves financially." But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said something simple. "I'm removing myself." His head snapped up. "You can't. I can renegotiate or force restructuring. I won't carry debt I don't control." His voice rose slightly. "So you're just abandoning me?" Abandoning. Interesting word. "No," I said calmly. "I'm retiring." He didn't like that. The next week, formal notices went out. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't reckless. I just stopped cushioning. The bank required him to refinance without me or liquidate equipment. Suddenly, his financial independence didn't feel so sturdy. Carol called the same evening. "You're punishing him." "No," I replied, "I'm separating. That business is how he supports his family. And the loan risk is how I jeopardize mine." There it was again. Mine. I hadn't used that word in years. She went quiet. Because for decades I'd blurred the line between support and sacrifice. Now the line was sharp. A funny thing happens when you stop overextending yourself. People notice the absence. Emily texted 2 days later. "Dad, what's going on? Brian says the bank's pressuring him." I typed back, "The bank is clarifying responsibilities." She didn't respond. "You see, kid, I didn't threaten. I didn't scream. I didn't drag anyone through the mud. I just stopped being the safety net. And when you've spent decades catching people, letting them feel gravity is shocking. That's when I saw the shift. The narrative changed. I wasn't the working loser anymore. I was the variable. The man whose signature still mattered. The man whose documentation could move numbers. The man whose silence now cost something. And that's when the begging started to simmer under the surface. Not apologies. Not yet. But tone changes. Text messages that started with, "Dad, can we talk?" Carol's voice softer when she asked questions, because they were starting to understand something simple. The applause hadn't ended my value. It had just woken me up. And once a man who's been underestimated realizes his leverage, he doesn't waste it. He uses it carefully. And we were only halfway through the grid shift. The real outage hadn't even begun. You don't notice a structure leaning at first. It happens slow. Then one day, a door doesn't close right. That's how it felt when the tone changed. Brian showed up at the house unannounced. Not loud, not defensive, worried. He stood in the doorway like he used to when he'd broken something as a kid. "Dad, the bank's giving me 30 days. I nodded and stepped aside so he could come in. He looked around like the place already felt unfamiliar. "They said if I can't refinance, they'll start seizing equipment." "That's standard," I said. He ran a hand through his hair. "You knew that?" "Yes." Silence stretched between us. "You're really doing this?" It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was realization. "I'm protecting myself," I said. "You never cared about protecting yourself before." That one landed. He wasn't wrong. For years I'd been the absorber, the buffer, the one who took the hit so nobody else felt it. But buffers wear out. "I should have," I said quietly. Carol came home later that evening with a different expression than usual. Less certainty, more calculation. "I spoke to my attorney," she said carefully. "Dragging out the house dispute will be expensive." "Yes." "And complicated." "Yes." She crossed her arms. "We could simplify this." There it was. Not apology. Adjustment. "What does simplify mean?" I asked. She hesitated. "We divide differently. More reasonably." More reasonably. Funny how reasonable expands when leverage shifts. 2 days later, Emily called. Not sharp, not condescending. Small. "Dad, are you really going to let Brian lose everything?" I leaned back in my chair. "Did you think about me losing everything?" "That's different." "How?" Long pause. "You're our father." "Exactly." I let that sit there, because that was the core of it. I'd always been the constant, the fallback plan, the guarantee. They built their risks on the assumption that I'd always absorb the shock. Now they were feeling it themselves. That night, I sat alone on the back porch. Early October air, crisp, quiet. I thought about the party again, the clapping, the words. Best day ever. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt detached, like I'd stepped outside the picture frame and could finally see the whole thing. They hadn't hated me. They'd just minimized me, turned me into a background utility, useful until unnecessary. And when they believed I was unnecessary, they celebrated. That's a hard truth to swallow. But once you do, it clears your vision. The next morning, I made one more call. Not to punish, not to threaten, to propose terms. If Brian refinanced within 30 days, I'd sign off cleanly. No public dispute, no collection escalation. If Carol agreed to an adjusted equity division that reflected documented contributions, I wouldn't drag proceedings into court. Controlled exits. Not chaos. Because revenge doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it means allowing gravity to do its job, then offering a hand only if respect comes with it. That evening, Brian returned. This time, he didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He sat at the kitchen table and said something I hadn't heard in years. "I didn't realize how much you were still carrying." I nodded once. That was the point. He swallowed. I shouldn't have said what I said at the party. There it was. Small, but real. Not dramatic, not tearful, just honest. And honesty weighs more than applause. You see, kid, power isn't loud. It's quiet. It's knowing when to hold and when to release. They thought my retirement meant decline. Instead, it meant I finally stopped cushioning their fall. And when people hit the ground unexpectedly, they start looking for the person who used to catch them. The begging hadn't fully begun yet, but the posture had changed. Shoulders lower, voices softer, questions replacing declarations. That's the sound of gravity. And once people feel it, they start respecting the man who understands how weight works. We're getting close now. Because the next move wasn't about money. It was about something deeper. Respect. And that's the one thing you can't refinance. Money is easy to argue about. Respect is harder. Because once you realize it's missing, you can't unsee it. Brian refinanced. Took him 23 days, sold 2 trucks, let go of 1 employee, trimmed everything down to survive without my name attached to the loan. He didn't thank me when it closed, but he came by the house afterward, stood in the driveway, hands in his pockets. "It's done," he said. "I know." He shifted his weight. "I had to make some changes. That's what responsibility feels like." He didn't argue. He just nodded. That was new. Carol's attorney sent a revised proposal the same week. No more automatic half. Now it was structured, documented, adjusted for traceable separate property. It still gave her something fair, but not the windfall she'd imagined. She came into the living room holding the paper like it offended her. "This is humiliating." I looked up from my coffee. "Publicly?" She didn't answer, because she understood. Humiliation isn't fun when you're on the receiving end. Emily stopped by on a Sunday afternoon. No speech prepared this time. No condescension. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at her hands. "I didn't realize you kept track of everything." "I didn't keep track to hurt you." "I know." Silence. Then she said something that surprised me. "We thought you didn't care about money." "I don't," I said. "I care about being treated like I matter." Her eyes watered a little. Not dramatic, just quiet. "That night, we thought you'd just laugh it off. You always did." I leaned back in my chair. That was the heart of it. I'd always absorbed it. The jokes, the dismissals, the subtle digs about being just a lineman. I'd smiled because I thought love meant tolerance, but tolerance without boundaries becomes permission, and permission turns into erasure. A week later, Carol sat across from me at the same kitchen table where we'd raised 2 kids. She looked tired. Not angry, just tired. "You're different," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm the same. I just stopped cushioning." She swallowed. "I didn't think you'd fight. I didn't think you'd clap." That one stayed in the air between us. Neither of us reached for it. The house was scheduled for appraisal 2 days later. We'd agreed to sell. Clean split. Move on. But here's what they didn't budget for. When the appraiser walked through those rooms, listing square footage and upgrades, I didn't feel loss. I felt ownership, because every beam in that place had my fingerprints on it, and for the first time, everyone in that house understood that value. Not the market value, my value. The begging started quietly, not with the word "please," with tone. "Dad, can we do dinner sometime?" Maybe we rushed things. We didn't mean it like that. Funny how clarity makes people reconsider their timing. I didn't gloat. I didn't punish. I simply didn't rush to fix their discomfort. Because respect that's learned too easily disappears too quickly. The final mediation meeting was calm. Numbers agreed, assets divided, signatures placed. When Carol stood to leave, she paused. "I didn't think retirement would change you like this." "It didn't," I said. "It just showed me who you were when the paycheck stopped." That wasn't cruel. It was honest. And honesty cuts cleaner than anger ever could. You know what the quietest moment was, kid? The day the house officially sold. We stood in the empty living room one last time. No furniture, no pictures, just echoes. Brian looked around and said, almost to himself, "You built all this?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, and for the first time in years, there wasn't a hint of embarrassment in his voice. Just recognition. Here's the thing. They thought they were free from the working loser. They thought retirement made me irrelevant. Instead, it forced them to see what they'd been standing on all along. And once you see that, you don't clap anymore. You listen. We're almost at the end now. Because what happened next? That wasn't about revenge. It was about something far more powerful. Dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, doesn't retire. The house closed on a Tuesday. Gray sky. Cleveland wind pushing leaves down the street like it was sweeping up after us. We signed the last documents in silence. No arguments, no speeches, just ink drying on 38 years. When the realtor handed us copies, Carol didn't look at me. Brian and Emily stood near the window, watching the moving truck disappear down the block. That house had held birthday cakes, broken bones, slammed doors, apologies whispered after midnight. Now it was just square footage with a new owner. Funny thing is, I didn't feel empty. I felt light. We met at a diner afterward. Neutral ground, coffee mugs, vinyl booths, the kind of place where nobody cares about your history. Brian cleared his throat first. Dad, we were wrong about how we handled things. Not dramatic, not tearful, just steady. Emily nodded beside him. We thought you'd just adapt, like you always did. There it was again. They'd mistaken my resilience for weakness. I stirred my coffee slowly. You confused patience with passivity, I said. They didn't argue. Carol finally spoke. I panicked about the future, she admitted. Retirement scared me. The idea of shrinking income, shrinking options. So you tried to shrink me first, I replied. She flinched, but she didn't deny it. Here's what people don't understand about a working man. When you spend your life climbing into storms, you don't fear instability. You learn how to stand in it. They thought retirement meant I'd crumble. Instead, it gave me time to see clearly. And clarity is dangerous when you've been underestimated. The sale proceeds were divided exactly as the revised agreement outlined. No courtroom battle, no screaming matches, just math, fair math. Brian stabilized his business. Emily stopped making little jokes about blue-collar thinking. Carol rented a townhouse across town. And me? I bought a small place near the lake. 1 bedroom, modest, paid outright. No debt, no shared signatures, just mine. A month later, Brian showed up with a toolbox. I figured you might need help fixing anything, he said awkwardly. I almost smiled. I've been fixing things longer than you've been alive. He grinned faintly. Yeah, I know. We worked side by side that afternoon, not talking much. Just the rhythm of tools and wood and quiet respect. That's when I realized something important. The apology wasn't in words. It was in posture, in tone, in the way he asked before moving something that belonged to me. Respect doesn't shout. It adjusts. Emily started calling once a week. Not to advise, not to manage, just to ask how I was. The first time she said, "I'm proud of you," it didn't feel performative. It felt earned. And Carol? We met for coffee once. Not reconciliation, not romance, just closure. She looked at me across that small table and said, "I misjudged you." I nodded. You misjudged my timing. Because that's the truth. I didn't change overnight. I just stopped accepting less. You know what the most ironic part was? The day I officially moved into my lake house, Brian helped carry the last box inside. He set it down, looked around, and said quietly, "You seem bigger here." Bigger, in a smaller house. Funny how that works. Here's what I learned, kid. When people think your value is tied to your paycheck, they celebrate when it stops. But real value? That's in the foundation, in the decades of showing up, in the quiet strength that doesn't announce itself. They clapped because they thought I was finished. What they didn't understand was this. A man who's climbed poles in lightning doesn't fear falling. He knows how to hold on. And sometimes the best revenge isn't ruining anyone. It's standing so steady that they finally see the ground they were standing on all along. That was the end of the applause, and the beginning of something quieter. Dignity. And dignity, once you take it back, doesn't need an audience. You'd think that's where the story ends. House sold, papers signed, pride restored. Old man rides off into a quiet retirement by the lake. That would be neat. Life's rarely neat. 3 months after I moved, my phone rang at 6:40 in the morning. Brian. No hesitation in his voice this time. Just urgency. "Dad, Mom's in the hospital." I sat up slowly in the dark. "What happened?" "Chest pain. They're running tests." There was a pause, then softer. "She keeps asking if you're coming." I stared at the ceiling. Funny thing about betrayal, it doesn't erase history. It just rearranges it. "I'll be there," I said. "Hospitals smell the same everywhere. Bleach and fear." Carol looked smaller in that bed. Smaller than she ever had in our kitchen. Smaller than she'd looked standing tall at that retirement party. Time humbles everyone eventually. She turned her head when I walked in. There was no pride left in her expression. No strategy. No performance. Just relief. "You came," she whispered. "Yes." I didn't sit immediately. I just stood there a moment. Because here's the truth I don't always admit out loud. Part of me had waited for a moment like this. Not for her to suffer, but for the illusion to fall completely. Retirement hadn't destroyed me. Time hadn't reduced me. And I wasn't standing there as a backup plan. I was standing there because I chose to. That's different. The tests came back clear. Anxiety, stress, nothing fatal. But fear has a way of stripping people down to honesty. When we were alone in the room, she said it quietly. "I thought I'd be safer without you." Safer. "I thought money was safety," she continued. "Security. Control." "And?" I asked. She looked at her hands. "I forgot who built the safety." That wasn't an apology. It was recognition. And recognition, when it's real, weighs more than regret. After she was discharged, I drove her back to her townhouse. No drama. No revival of marriage. Just two older people sitting in silence that wasn't hostile anymore. At the curb, she hesitated before getting out. "I didn't clap," she said suddenly. I looked at her. "At the party, the kids did. I didn't." I thought back. She was right. She hadn't clapped. She'd orchestrated. There's a difference. "I know," I said. She nodded once and closed the door. A week later, Brian invited me to dinner. Not a family summit. Not a reconciliation speech. Just dinner. When I walked in, no one announced anything. No one joked. Emily hugged me without performance. Brian poured me a drink without asking what I preferred. He remembered. That's how you know respect has taken root. It's in the details. Here's the part that surprised me most. I didn't want revenge anymore. Not because I forgave everything, but because I didn't need to win. I'd already reclaimed what mattered. They no longer saw me as the working loser. They saw me as the foundation. And foundations don't need applause. They just hold. You know, kid, retirement wasn't the end of my usefulness. It was the end of my willingness to be undervalued. There's a difference. When my son said best day ever, he thought it meant freedom from me. Turns out it was freedom for me. Freedom from being underestimated. Freedom from overextending. Freedom from confusing love with self-erasure. Life has a quiet sense of irony. They tried to retire me from relevance. Instead, they forced me to step into it. And here's the moral, if you're looking for one. Never clap too early when someone else's chapter closes. You might not understand the book, and never measure a man's worth by the paycheck that just stopped. Sometimes the most dangerous moment for the people around him is when he finally has time.